Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, to talk about the new DreamWorks animated film, The Wild Robot. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So on the surface, The Wild Robot may seem to have, much in common with Pixar's great 2008 film, WALL-E, where both films rely on a lot of visual storytelling to tell charming tales of misunderstood, isolated robots searching for their purpose in life. But despite sort of those surface level, narrative similarities, The Wild Robot is far from derivative, because this film is awesome. I loved almost everything going on in this film. Not only is it, I think, one of the most delightful films of the year, but I think this is a film that will finally propel like DreamWorks animation into the same, lofty stratosphere as Pixar's golden era. Because with very beautiful animation and a powerful story, The Wild Robot is a special film about finding love and purpose in a very difficult world. The film's director, Chris Sanders, also created the How to Train Your Dragon series of films, which personally I think is among, if not at the top of the best films in the DreamWorks canon. And with The Wild Robot, he definitely shows his steady hand once again, because really every aspect in this film from start to finish is just crafted with very meticulous care. And we have to start with the visuals for this, because the warm, like, watercolor animation style is nothing short of stunning. I think while not as like flashy or like attention grabbing as something like the acclaimed Spider-Verse films, this may be the most like visually pleasing film that I have seen in years. And those gorgeous visuals are bolstered by what is also a very excellent kind of musical score and soundtrack that kind of work together in a way that demonstrates just a degree of like artistry that is not often found in movies, animated or otherwise. And the soft visuals and the stellar music, I think, are just a perfect fit for this story and the tone of this film. Because on the drive home from the theater from this movie, one of my sons who watched the movie with me said, "I noticed that it wasn't like a lot of other films with lots of action and stuff. It was more about the robot's life." And I really liked it. I think kind of The Wild Robot in some ways offers a very like stark contrast to a movie, like Despicable Me 4, which seems, almost made in like a factory with the singular goal of, just offering very like hypercharged, diverting entertainment to younger viewers, which, hey, there's nothing wrong with that approach. Either. And in contrast to that, The Wild Robot has a much more like gentle and like almost meditative feel to it. It's a more mature story that doesn't stoop down too low, to make itself accessible to younger viewers, but neither does it like forget kids or leave them behind either. The story doesn't like sugarcoat any of the harsher realities of life, which we'll get to in just a second with the content section, but it's also just a very wholesome and family-friendly story. It lacks any of like the profanity or just other kind of questionable content that has seemed to find its way into a bunch of other animated films in recent years. I think it's a movie that can be enjoyed by all ages, even if kind of the different ages appreciate it for different reasons. The Wild Robot may be like contemplative, but it doesn't mean it's boring by any means, because there are plenty of exciting moments in this as well, such as, a scene where the animals on the island must band together to, wage war against the futuristic, menacing robots, or where Roz, who is the name of the robot protagonist in this, has to brave an ice storm to rescue the creatures that are caught out in the deathly cold. I think the story is not necessarily slow, but it just never skips over kind of the more introspective moments in its rush to just get on to the next exciting action sequence. I think most of the narrative tension does stem more from like internal conflicts rather than it does against like battling against, external villains. And I think the heartfelt scenes, such as, my personal favorite, where the robot must help sort of this outcast gosling runt learn how to fly for the first time, are emotionally satisfying and no less compelling than the more kind of high stakes, action sequences. And kind of in that way, the story explores kind of some sweeping themes about just life and purpose, and just heads up to you parents out there that there are definitely some moments in this that will tug on the old heartstrings, of your parent heart. But I think The Wild Robot is more like thematic than it is message driven, because even my own two 9-year-old boys, they struggled afterwards to pinpoint like one primary message or moral afterwards. I think kind of like Roz, who in the film, who possesses very high-end computing, processor for rational thinking, but ultimately learns to navigate her, circumstances by following her own heart. This is a film that strives more to make audiences feel something rather than merely conveying a message. And even though this story is almost entirely devoid of any human characters, The Wild Robot is a very fundamentally human story about the experience of love that just makes life worth living. It may not be the kind of movie that was going to send kids out of the theater just buzzing with excitement, but I think audiences will be the better for having had the very rich and just wholesome themes wash over them. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, like I said, really not a whole lot here. For language, the only thing that I noticed is there are two usages where a character says, "that sucked," and then there may have been one possible, utterance of God, although it wasn't clearly articulated, and it may have just been a character kind of groaning. Violence is probably where the most comes from, because hey, nature is a violent place, and although the animals in this story, for the most part, kind of coexist, there does remain all throughout the uncomfortable reality that some are predators and some are prey. For instance, you see a crab in one scene that is kind of pulled apart pretty violently by a fox and eaten, kind of boiled in water. And then in a later scene where the animals are kind of united together, you see another crab. And there are just other scenes where characters, animals are killed either by other animals or by some of the robots, but none of the violence is depicted, beyond maybe that unfortunate crab, in any sort of graphic manner. And lastly, sexuality, there's nothing going on with that in this film. As far as worldview themes, things going on beneath the surface, The Wild Robot does have, I think, some pretty rich, almost biblical themes, because in one sense, the entire film plays out as like a sort of metaphor, or at least like a reflection of the biblical story of Eden. Because at the beginning of the story, Roz, who again is the robot, wakes up in the jungle and, filled with a very like bubbly, optimism about her life. But that very idyllic worldview is quickly shaken as she encounters a very kind of hostile, violent world around her. And from there, she is propelled kind of by a desire to just discover her purpose, because she has an innate understanding that she was created for a purpose. There's one character that asks her, who made you? To which she responds, "I was made." And kind of from there, just search for, who made me and why was I created. Although I will say that the metaphor isn't always necessarily just, a perfect, fits snugly like a glove, because there's also just an indication that her creators may not have always been just purely benevolent, and there is an aspect of her sort of breaking the rules and rebelling against her programming. But kind of the answer to the question of what is Roz's purpose in this film is explored in several, I think, interesting ways. I think just on the immediate surface, it is very much applied to parenting, and I think motherhood in particular, as she chooses to care for that orphaned gosling. And I think the film provides some very vivid imagery just about the cost, the sacrifices of that important role, as Roz, who begins as very like fresh and polished and new, throughout the film becomes increasingly scarred and disfigured and dirty as she sacrifices everything for the sake of the child. But I think in like a broader sense, kind of the governing purpose in life, as emphasized in this film, is shown simply to be love. I think Christians can affirm that biblical theme, verses such as Matthew 22:37 or 1 Corinthians 13, where we are created to be loved and to love others. I think as a very high-tech robot, Roz has, like I said, impressive computing power, rational abilities, but it's really only after she develops kind of like her metaphorical heart that she's finally able to find peace. There's a great speech near the end of this film where Roz delivers to a group of animals, where she notes that as a robot and as animals, they are mostly driven by, mere instinct for survival, and yet she urges them that they must become more than our programming. And this sense that the world is a harsh place, but kind of that experience of love is really what makes life worth living. So in the end, this movie is fantastic. I loved this movie. I think for decades, sort of Pixar Studios has largely stood alone as like the gold standard in mature, emotionally deep animated storytelling. I think the success of Inside Out 2 earlier this year shows that reports of Pixar's demise may be a bit premature, but I think DreamWorks proves in this film that Pixar is clearly no longer the only game in town. In some ways, The Wild Robot may be the most Pixar-y film that Pixar never made. As an excellent showcase and just beautiful, powerful storytelling, The Wild Robot is arguably the best animated film of the year, and it may be my personal favorite film of the year, period. I suspect that this movie will be celebrated at the next Academy Awards, and I think the honor will be well deserved, because sometimes it is important to just be reminded of the love and beauty that makes us human, even when that timely reminder comes from an animated robot. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this film as much as I did, if you take your kids, if they found it too slow or if they were moved, emotionally the way I was, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. If you have done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, get lots of other movie reviews and our Faith and Pop Culture podcast and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.